If there is one thing that defines sport and the reason why we all love it, or presumably all of you watching this video at least, it is surely its unpredictability. If a family member, friend or partner has ever asked you why you can't just record the football, rugby or cricket and watch it later, or rewind it mid-game to catch a moment you missed, and you were disgusted by the idea, then you are someone who understands this concept. Football is a live sport, and you are living and breathing that moment along with everyone else in the stadium. It's unscripted, neither you or your mate sat next to you, or anyone else in the world for that matter, have any idea what is about to happen next. It's what makes sport special, it's what gives it a certain exhilarating magic that can't be replicated even by the best film or the most well-made TV show. So what happens when football loses that magic? Using the Premier League as an example, the top 6 in the top flight of English football has been an incredibly exclusive club over the last 10 years. Following a rigid top 4 during the 2000s, a top 6 emerged in the 2010s, and they have been understandably stubborn when it comes to letting anyone else in. In the 10 seasons from the 2008-09 season up until the 2018-19 season, in theory, 60 different clubs could have finished in the top 6 in the Premier League. Of course, no one expects that kind of unpredictability, but the reality is a startlingly tedious one. Over the course of an entire decade, only 5 teams have disrupted Manchester United, Manchester City, Arsenal, Liverpool, Chelsea and Tottenham's dominance over the top 6 positions in the Premier League. Those clubs are Southampton, Leicester and Newcastle, each of whom have only managed the feat once, and Aston Villa and Everton, who have each done so twice. What's more, only one of those teams has managed to go beyond penetrating not just the top 6, but the top 4, in a period of 10 years. Yet the Premier League has been sold to us as the best league in the world due in no small part to its mythical unpredictability and wild surprises. This wasn't always the case. There have been dominant teams down the years like Aston Villa in the 1890s and Liverpool in the 1980s, but never such an established order at the top end of the division. Just a quick glance at the final First Division table for the 1991-92 season, prior to the Premier League rebranding the following season, provides a timely reminder of how much more open things were as recently as the 1990s, with Leeds United and Sheffield Wednesday finishing first and third in the top flight. In the 1946-47 season, Stoke City came within 2 points of winning the First Division. The following season they finished 15th, and by the early 1950s they had been relegated. This wasn't a rare occurrence. Tottenham finished third in the top flight in the 1933-34 campaign, but were relegated the following season. They returned to the top flight in 1950 and won the First Division title in their first season back in the big time. More recently, Brian Clough guided both Nottingham Forest and Derby County from the depths of the Second Division to the First Division Championship, winning the title with Forest in the club's first season back in the top flight, much like Arthur Rowe had done at Tottenham. Fans were just as passionate and partisan for more than a century of football as they are now, but they understood the vagaries of the sport. In fact, they adored it. Not when their own team was staring down the barrel of relegation, of course, but ultimately that was football, and as the old adage went, there's always next season. That is no longer the case. For one of the big 6 in today's top flight, finishing 5th is a disgrace, and 7th means you have an absolute crisis on your hands. For the rest of the league, breaking into the top 6 is like some utopian holy grail to be cherished, perhaps as a once-in-a-lifetime achievement, and a top 4 finish bordering on fairy tale. I ought to address the elephant in the room, which is Leicester City. The Foxes are the only club outside of the current Big 6 to have broken into the top 4 in the Premier League over the last 10 years, and when they did so, they went ahead and won the division in the 2015-16 season. That was an extraordinary achievement. Truly extraordinary. And whilst it shows that football is a sport in which miracles can still be pulled off, it is described as a miracle for good reason. Leicester are on the march once again this season under Brendan Rodgers, but even the most starry-eyed of Foxes fans doesn't think that they're genuinely going to rival Liverpool for the Premier League title, and the vast majority would snap your hands off if you offered them 4th place right now. For more than a quarter of a century, wages in football have absolutely skyrocketed. The average salary of a Premier League footballer in 1992 was £75,000 a year, and now it's more than £50,000 a week, which is equivalent to £2.6 million a year. That's a 3,366% increase. Without getting bogged down in the numbers, it's a startling rise, and people understandably sometimes beg the question of why salaries in football have risen so extortionately. Of course, commercial sales, gate receipts and particularly TV money have all risen exponentially since the dawn of the Premier League, yet clubs have largely become less and less profitable. There are more clubs going bankrupt in England now, despite more money swimming around the sport than ever before, so why do they keep paying footballers more and more? The answer is a very simple one, as David Goldblatt points out in his excellent book, The Game of Our Lives, and it's the same as the answer to why so few clubs have dominated the upper echelons of football in this country for so long. The higher your wage budget, the more points you will amass. It's that simple. It's not the case that the team with the highest wage budget will finish top and the team with the lowest will finish bottom. Fundamental principles of management, recruitment, and team cohesion obviously play their part, but by and large, for the last decade, looking at a team's wage expenditure will give you an excellent idea of where they are likely to finish in the league table. In the 2017-18 season, which is the most recent campaign in which we can view full published accounts, the 6 clubs who spent the most money on wages in the Premier League were Manchester United, Liverpool, Manchester City, Chelsea, Arsenal and Tottenham, in that order. The Premier League's top 6 in the actual league table that season read Manchester City, Manchester United, Tottenham, Liverpool, Chelsea and Arsenal. This is a problem that runs deep to the core of not just English football, but football across the globe. For years it was the case that if you discovered or nurtured a gem of a footballer, he could be your talisman for a generation, ensuring bumper crowds and many additional points every season. In the heyday of the England team, perhaps the finest player in the world in Stanley Matthews spent the vast majority of his career with Stoke City, with his only time away being at Blackpool. Tom Finney played out his entire career with Preston North End, and Wilf Mannion was virtually a one-club man at Middlesbrough. No one sensible is advocating a return to the days of the retain and transfer system that treated footballers like chattel, nor even a maximum wage. But in theory, this ought to be a real dilemma for football's top bosses. The retain and transfer system, after all, was only introduced because small clubs were frustrated about losing their best players, and the FA and Football League feared that a concentration of talent at the top would impact competitiveness and damage the league pyramid as a whole. We now have an extreme concentration of talent not just in the English game and not just of English players, but of the best players from the entire world at the leading clubs in England, Spain, Italy, France and Germany. It has, just as the Football League anticipated, caused a radical reduction in competitiveness. Football, much like society as a whole, appears to be becoming more unequal year upon year, and yet this isn't viewed as particularly troublesome for football's governing bodies, certainly not for the likes of La Liga, the Premier League and the Champions League. Watching top-flight football in England has never been more expensive or more predictable, yet we continue to see record crowds. Every single Premier League stadium is currently running at 90% of capacity or higher. Manchester United continue to average more than 70,000 fans at their home games, Tottenham, West Ham and Arsenal can all fill their 60,000-seater arenas, and Liverpool cannot put in seats fast enough to match the demand in terms of supporters wanting to turn up at Anfield. Football has never been more popular both on our screens and in our stadiums, despite the fact most of us could take a pretty good stab at predicting how the table is going to look come the end of the season before a ball has even been kicked. How can that make any sense? Are we all just being taken for fools? One important factor we must take into account is the change in demographic of match-attending football fans. In the mid-1980s, the average age of a fan at a First Division football match was 25. Now it's 47. Although that doesn't seem particularly surprising, almost doubling the average age of match-attending fans is a significant shift. At the same time in the mid-1980s, an estimated 19% of fans at First Division matches were either unemployed or full-time students. Today that figure stands at 2%. Football has simply become too expensive for an enormous amount of people. Last month, I paid over £80 for 2 tickets to watch Hull City play Leeds United. That's not an insignificant sum for someone who talks rubbish about football for a living, and there are a great many people not as fortunate as me. That's not to suggest that the average age of a football fan has changed or that disposable income is a prerequisite to being a football fan, but it is to match-going fans. Ultimately, most football fans don't regularly attend matches, and the unsurprising consequence of that is a rise in long-distance support of the bigger clubs. I was fortunate enough, or unfortunate enough, at times I suppose you might suggest, that my dad took me with him to watch Hull City games from a young age. For me, there was never a decision to be made about which football club I supported. My dad supported Hull City, both my granddad supported Hull City, and I went to watch Hull City every week. For a long time, I found it bizarre that anyone wouldn't want to support their local team, and I would give my mates a fair bit of stick for not doing so, but who is to say who I would have grown up supporting had no one dragged me to games when I was 6 or 7 years old. People who catch the football bug but don't have that same connection with their local club invariably end up following one of the top teams. I have friends who support Arsenal, Liverpool and Manchester United, all with no links to the club themselves, nor the city in which they play their football. Some may have fallen in love with Thierry Henry at a young age, or perhaps just grown up in an era of Liverpool or Manchester United dominance. The end result is the same, and for supporters of a Big Six club, the Big Six dominating, isn't necessarily that boring. It could be argued, in fact, that the goalposts have just shifted for every club. Whilst in the 1970s, success for Derby County would have been the First Division title and failure would be relegation, now success would just be winning promotion back into the top flight. There was a time when Burnley were champions of England, but equally capable of finishing the bottom half. Those would be the highs and lows of a Burnley fan's expectations going into a season. Now it's a case of let's secure 17th place, and a 7th place finish, as they achieved a couple of seasons ago, is the absolute pinnacle. It's a depressing reality in many respects for 7th to be the zenith for so many clubs, but perhaps that is the new era of football. The reason almost every country on earth has a Football League pyramid is because, in theory, every club ought to be able to rise from the very bottom to the very top, and vice versa. For younger supporters in particular, though, they haven't even had to shift their range of expectations. If you've grown up knowing there is a defined top 4 or top 6, which is as good as set in stone, there doesn't seem to be anything wrong or bizarre about that. It's worth pointing out that I've talked almost exclusively in this video about the Premier League. Everything I've said is pretty much true of all of Europe's major leagues, in some cases even more so, but it isn't true of the lower leagues. If you look at the Championship and League One tables right now, they are veritable festivals of unpredictability. As someone who has watched a lot of Championship football this season, the difference between the top and the bottom of the division is minuscule. West Brom and Leeds fans won't thank me for saying it, and make no mistake, they are the top 2 on merit, but there is so little to split teams from top to bottom in this league. If you were to try and predict the Championship top 6 going into a season, as I often have, you will no doubt find yourself doing a lot worse than your Premier League top 6 predictions. It's for that reason that you will hear some supporters of yo-yo clubs such as West Brom or my own club Hull City in recent times saying they prefer the Championship to the Premier League. Aside from the fact that you get more games and you don't have to watch your team get beat every week, the league is also a throwback in terms of openness and unpredictability. So if the lower leagues are unpredictable, about 12 Premier League teams are just scared to death of relegation all season, and the top 6 are just happy vying between those places with one another, perhaps it's no surprise that I'm the only person who is here talking about what a closed shop football has become. I think there's some truth to that argument, but it can't dispel all of those concerns. When a team achieves the rare feat of seemingly becoming established in the Premier League with few concerns of relegation but isn't one of the top 6, you often see this realisation come over them. I've seen it in action at the likes of Stoke and Swansea in recent years, both of whom have since been relegated of course, but did at one time appear to be in that unusual twilight zone between the relegation strugglers and the top 6. Both teams' fans will look back now with fond memories on some of the performances they put in during those years, their cup runs, and even playing European football, but the worst stages in which they realised they'd probably reached the pinnacle of what they could achieve. You could argue either that Leicester make all these arguments redundant, or that it was a freak occurrence able to be written off as anomalous, but the hard truth is that the fans of 90% of Football League clubs have already come to the realisation that they will never see their team win a top-flight league title or a major trophy, and that includes some pretty big clubs. There was a time when people argued that financial fair play would set things right, but that always seemed like a counterintuitive suggestion to me. Teams spending fortunes like Chelsea or Man City in order to compete at the highest level may not have been fairy tale stuff or particularly romantic, but it did at least rock the boat a bit. FFP, if actually adhered to, only serves to maintain the status quo. If anything, it makes the upper echelons of football even more rigid rather than more open. Blackburn Rovers spending fortunes to win a league title in the 1990s and then getting relegated after spending a lot less wasn't necessarily as surprising as many exploits by teams in the pre-Premier League era, but it was still more unusual than the 25 years since, with the sole exception of Leicester in 2016 again. There are other factors to this, no doubt, such as thrilling upsets in individual matches giving the false illusion of unpredictability to football as a whole, but I'll wrap up there before this video becomes too long. I must admit, I am as much of a sucker as anyone else. I still watch Hull City live almost every week, and I still watch mounds of Premier League, La Liga, Bundesliga, and Champions League games in spite of the inevitability of so many competitions as a whole. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Is football getting more boring, or does predictability have no bearing on entertainment or magic? And if it is getting more boring, why do none of us seem to care? To be clear, I'm not suggesting the product on offer, the football itself on a game-by-game basis, is necessarily more boring, although that is now more predictable than ever as well, but rather the competitions at the highest level as a whole. Thank you all for watching, give us a like if you enjoyed listening to my ramblings, and make sure to subscribe to HITC Sevens and turn on notifications if you'd like to hear more of them in the future.